Oh, let me just accept that. Perfect. So recording has just started. That's fantastic. So yeah, just a little bit of housekeeping. Of course, I'm not going to be able to keep an inventory of your toilet locations if you joined remotely. So look out for signs naturally. Yeah, thank you again, obviously, for the opportunity here. Any questions, please pop them in the chat window. I'll happily give a little introduction about me in a moment's time, but just to set your expectations for timescales, kick off this presentation now. An introduction to AppCheck with a demonstration of how our platform works, and taking any questions towards the end of the session. We should hopefully be done by about sort of 7:30, 7:45. Immo, if you don't mind me asking, are you able from your side to admit people in as they pop into the webinar?
Yes, indeed. I just did that.
Okay, fantastic. Just wanted to make sure that was covered. So fantastic. So thanks again, obviously, for everybody that's joined. Let's jump into things. So a little about me, as per the actual event itself, what was stated online. I'm our senior consultant here at AppCheck, a member of our sales team, sort of a hybrid between both sales and onboarding new partners and whatnot. So that's me, and happy to take any questions as we go through things. From a technical aspect, I'll go as far as I can into giving you the technical overview of AppCheck, but of course I'm happy to take questions towards the end or arrange follow-up sessions as we go through. And obviously this presentation is really to give you that overview of what AppCheck does, where we come from, our journey, amongst obviously being able to share with you how to avoid the worst case scenario, our technical capabilities and benefits, what we actually do with proactive regular testing, and how to support our partners and the world get ahead of the game and in front of hackers. Being able to integrate into the software development lifecycle and raising awareness to development is another sort of aspect of this presentation, as well as some of our customer journeys, what they've been on, how they started, and how they managed to implement AppCheck and build that sustainable strategy with us. And we'll look at a few testimonials as we jump through things in a bit more further detail. As I mentioned, do a bit of a demonstration so you can see how the platform looks and works. And any questions at the end, more than welcome to fire away. Happy to take them as well. So let's jump into things. So today's agenda is pretty much our mission statement, which is to bridge the gap between automated and manual penetration testing. AppCheck's based just outside Leeds. We're a UK company, born and bred and supported by our team based out of our head office, as you can see there in Bristol. Where we actually started, though, is quite interesting. We actually were founded out of a team of manual penetration testers. That was the nature of what we did as our service back in 2003. Very, very technically savvy people decided to build a tool for themselves to make their job easier. So they wanted to overcome laborious tasks. They wanted to go off and find more exotic vulnerabilities. And naturally, AppCheck developed and blossomed into the tool that they fundamentally needed it to become. In 2008, after about 5 years of development and benefit of using this tool for themselves, the market was approached, and then AppCheck has blossomed since there. So in 2014, started trading commercially as who we are today, emulating and automating as much of what you would expect of a manual assessment as truly possible. And we're now partnered with over a couple of thousand organizations across the globe. And in 2021, we became a registered CNA. So for those obviously may not know what that is and why that's worth hearing, a CNA for us is based upon our credibility and our experience with finding brand new zero-day vulnerabilities the world has never seen before. So we're punching into databases that fundamentally signature-driven products are pulling from, looking at the known vulnerabilities. And we have a track record of finding them across Microsoft, eBay, YouTube, CMS platforms, and so on. And that's really why we have achieved this level of accreditation in what we do. And it's nice to say that we were shortlisted for the SC Awards in 2022 as well, thanks to our abilities with vulnerability scanning and automated pen testing. So the main thing to say above all of else, though, is that given that our product and our actual service is built and supported and developed by industry experts and pen testers, the main thing is to say that they're also on hand to support any of our partners too. So these are the levels of expectation you can get from onboarding and remedial guidance and support, of course, as time goes by. But jumping into things in a bit more of the spectrum of what you would be looking for when it comes to automated penetration testing, fundamentally is peace of mind. And arguably, when we consider how AppCheck in an automated setting might be comparable to a manual penetration test, you could argue that manual penetration testing is like driving a car without car insurance, between set testing cycles, as potentially, as well as achieving that MOT certificate, to use the analogy, driving away and hoping nothing goes wrong until you test again. And sometimes those test cycles can be a year, sometimes they can be even longer, sometimes they can be sporadic. And so with us, we're giving the means to be having peace of mind as regular, as often as possible. We know the world that we're in today, and being able to stay vigilant and on top of the risks associated to those implications of what could happen in the worst case scenario of being hacked. We see the costs increasing year upon year, as well as how they are targeted to obviously increase by the trillions by 2025. And of course, this is hypothetical, but to any organization that maybe sat there listening to this, of course, what would the implications mean if you were exploited? And just to give some examples of those, we saw it with British Airways when they were fined 183 million from their cyber attack. We saw it even most recently with Arnold Clark, of course, being unfortunately at the receiving end of a hack, of a data breach related instance. And whether it's a large organization, a small organization, if you Google companies that have been hacked, it will always present to you the biggest companies that have been hacked. And unfortunately, that seems to be what humans seem to thrive upon, is the size of the organization that's been hacked. But in reality, it's everybody. Nobody is necessarily safe. Not to preach to you too much in this scenario here, but in reality, when we look at the statistics of how many small organizations actually survive after being hacked, it's very small. And of course, that might not reach the news, or might not be as relevant to us if we're not looking for it. But it does happen. When Tuckers were targeted in March 2022, they were attacked by the same cyber hacking team, group, if you will, that previously were targeting SMEs. Of course, these things go on behind the scenes. And if you can see the faint image just behind there, the list of companies that get hacked over the years is unfortunately growing. So how can we learn from others' downfalls? I saw a Forbes article recently that said why taking pleasure in others' misfortune can actually be good for your mental health. And it made me sort of sit there, scratch my head, and I thought, well, that's not particularly relevant to our industry. When we consider cyber security, we don't want to piggyback off the bandwagon of other organizations being hacked. And just some sort of hypothetical scenarios here. Let's just say we know a business that's been hacked. These questions of, do we feel we've actually been gifted a chance to learn from their downfalls, given it wasn't us? Do we feel that we can act proactively now if we need to? Do we even think, thankfully that wasn't me, and we kind of quietly move on with our day-to-day lives? Not to mention a couple of others there as well. And the reality is that budgets, processes, day-to-day life, it gets in the way of all of this. And we can have the best intentions in the world to stay vigilant as best we can, but we're human. And of course, hackers, they're human as well, if not using automated tools to obviously make their lives easier. But in reality, it's a murders by numbers approach. And they don't care who they hack, how they hack them. It's just literally how easy it is for them. And we do, unfortunately, see in cybersecurity, and in my role especially, when I actually joined AppCheck, I went through an induction week to start off with. And there were just a funny little story. There were two of our sales team members came in to basically drag my trainer away. It was a sales manager at the time, and was saying, our company's just called into the office. They've been hacked. They were hacked 6 months ago. They've only just found out now, and they're reaching out to us to see if we can offer them a means to protect themselves better. And literally within 24 hours, the same week, I had another colleague come through the door with the exact same story. And it felt a little bit close to home, if you will, in terms of me joining a cybersecurity organization that's offering the means to have that peace of mind and protect themselves. And so these things happen. I've seen them firsthand. And unfortunately, we can have the best will in the world to believe that our processes are the best strategies in place. But when an organization is actually hacked, it's then going to be very clear what was actually missing to begin with. So I've put these little nerd alert warnings in each PowerPoint presentation just to keep it lighthearted, as they are towards the end of the day. But if everybody's seen the film The Matrix, of course, when you consider Neo in the first instance trying to dodge those bullets versus how he became a lot more capable, confident, and able in his processes, you can see obviously how he was able to have that peace of mind and that confidence that he could block any incoming bullets from that point forward. I am an absolute nerd, so you'll probably see more of these as we go through the presentation. But I'm always keen to take any questions, or anybody wants to add any thoughts to that towards the end of the session too. So here's just a bit of a summary as to why partners use AppCheck, why they consider starting a partnership with us. And the people that we have here, whether I reference the likes of Gary O'Leary Steele, or as our technical director, or any member of our team that we have most faith in, is that they're here to support our partners with onboarding, continual support, growth, and their expertise that are available. It's just one of those unique selling points that we have. And the main thing here is to say that when it comes to actually a partner considering, well, what does penetration testing mean to us? It could be a very simple estate versus quite a complex one for a larger organization, and we'll be able to support whether it's a hugely demanding IT estate, from the simplest things of we're starting out our journey, we've never done testing before, perhaps an organization is displacing having a manual test or a sporadic test and they're considering regular testing, right the way through to maybe an organization's got a vulnerability scanner in place, or a couple of different tools similar in place. How can they harmonize, streamline, and create a better environment for being able to tick off a few of the things we're going to come into in a moment's time, such as testing capabilities. But AppCheck has a conscious effort to grow partnerships with organizations that are pioneers in their own industry. HubSpot's a great example of this. It's organizations that we see like HubSpot that are ahead of the curve, and it helps us to direct our attention and have confidence in what we then release to the market, which will be of demand. A perfect example of this is the ability to test APIs, something that AppCheck can do, something that all organizations are growingly using more and more. And of course, a lot of these things stem from our experience of working with companies like HubSpot and so on. So whether you're starting out, whether you've been doing this for a long time, whether you have manual penetration testing, or you've never heard of penetration testing, AppCheck's here to support your journey if necessary. And it's going to get a little bit more technical now, just to set those expectations. But what we've actually got is a bit of a summary here of what you would expect to include within that sort of scope. So what actually do we test? What might fall within that scope? Well, we look at things in quite a simple way, kind of a coin, if you will. On one side, you have your outer perimeter, your exterior facing targets, such as web applications, websites. And on the inside, then you've got your infrastructure, your treasure chest as well of data, where you're trying to protect everything that goes on behind the scenes. Look at your servers, look at your potential open ports, your operating systems and applications that may be running. There's an abundance of different things that can fall within the scope here, as well as mentioned API testing. But in reality, we can accommodate both a simple approach as well as that complex approach, which kind of takes us into integrations in a short while. But we're going to come back to that in a little bit later, because that potentially could be deemed as a sort of short to medium strategy, being able to use AppCheck as an interoperable product that would work within your CI/CD pipelines or into that software development lifecycle, which we'll present in a bit more detail. So just to give you an overview of what the sort of typical estate coverage might look like, out of the box functionality will be presented to you in a demonstration, so you can see how AppCheck works, how a penetration test would get configured, which we'll come back to shortly. And as mentioned, that web application and website outer perimeter, we've got some really nice little unique points here, such as we're testing single page applications, being able to fingerprint CMS platforms. The good news is that we're technology agnostic, so it doesn't matter if your back end is built in Java or .NET or PHP, or if your front end is in JavaScript, for example, or jQuery, or so on and so forth. These are the sorts of questions, obviously, that are always great to understand. But with us, we would target an application based upon its domain, its URL, and that's all we really need to understand at the early stages. So if you have an internal network, then of course we'll be able to test in those environments too. We can do things like virtual machine scanning hubs, but without getting too into the nitty-gritty detail, there's a lot that AppCheck can do, but we're primarily a DAST solution, which obviously could be explained on then how it's complementary to SAST, basically just actively testing and probing using real traffic and requests, as opposed to testing the code, effectively in an offline analysis, sort of point of creation point of view. So we'll come back to some of these things. If anybody's got any questions for how AppCheck would support the likes of ISO 27001 compliance or Cyber Essentials or so on, then more than welcome to take those questions. But primarily the reason why I present all of this is because these are areas in which we don't want to leave any stones left unturned, and we want to give comprehensive testing across what you would deem as necessary within the estate. So there are just some of the examples, as mentioned to you. Just going back to what I said earlier, being technology agnostic, these are less challenges, more just sort of nice to share examples, if you will. I'm going to go over this quite quickly. I feel like some of these things might be a little bit salesy for today, but primarily the way that we test is more comparable to what you would expect of a manual penetration tester. This is a tongue-in-cheek analogy, but arguably we're all human. And if you consider a manual penetration test being primarily done by a human, then me as a salesperson, if I wake up one morning and I haven't had my coffee, I might not be at my best game. And sometimes there are things that could dictate our successes, whether you approach an organization and you get their best tester versus you get another tester because their best one's off busy on one of their key clients. These sorts of things do happen, and we do see them happening. But what AppCheck does is it emulates the way that a penetration tester would work by using first principle testing methodology. We're not bound to a signature driven approach of looking at a list of CVEs and seeing if you're susceptible to them. We're obviously have a track record of finding those 0 days, as mentioned before, and that's how we became a CNA. And when I reference the expression leave no stone left unturned, it primarily is thanks to a multi-layered approach, which looks like this. So web application target environment, what might a hacker do if they were trying to exploit you? What might a manual penetration tester do if they are also trying to establish any potential routes of vulnerabilities, or what could there be in your estate? These are the sorts of environments that AppCheck is building a mapped attack surface around in an automated setting to identify all different facets and locations within your IT estate to understand, well, I need to build visibility. I need control of the security posture. So therefore, where could these vulnerabilities exist? So of course, we take these different approaches, such as the OSINT layers as well, when we do our discovery work, to try and ensure that AppCheck is delivering and it's firing on all cylinders when it tests for you. So going back to the examples I shared earlier, such as British Airways hack, looking at the JavaScript that they had in the corner of their screen as one example here, about how they were potentially exploitable and therefore, well, exploited to get through to the infrastructure. External resources and subdomains and anything connected, as whether it be first or third party to your applications in any way, have been seen historically to be a really simple route for a hacker to identify vulnerabilities. And we've seen it with Uber, Slack, and even the US government. So what AppCheck has done proactively is build a subdomain takeover audit, which basically, a part of the pen test that you'd expect, would then look at those first or third party resources, if you will, whether it be a link to YouTube, Instagram, a chat bar in the corner of the screen, and understand if they are vulnerable and provide you with the visibility that any of these, if they are vulnerable, what impact that could have to you. We saw it all before. If obviously people on this call are familiar with the likes of Log4j, AppCheck are very, very quick and were very quick in December of 2021 to ensure that our partners had the means to test for this vulnerability very fast. The remedial guidance, if you recall, was unplug anything affected, panic stations hit, but in reality, we were just offering competent scanning abilities to our partners to be able to test for these things, being able to communicate the severity and the impact of what could happen if you're susceptible to that. And we still do that to this day when it comes to these new templates, which will be presented to you in the demonstration. But then sometimes, just to turn that on its head, something new could hit the world, like OpenSSL, where you do get that time to panic situation. You do get that human response to say, hang on a minute, I need to test for this right away. And actually, in this case, as much as we were able to communicate what the vulnerability was, the fact that it hit the world, the fact we were able to test for it, in reality, this was actually false flag, if you will. It was less of a concern than we originally anticipated, than the world originally anticipated. And so the key for us was communication at the earliest possible instance. Organizations out there could have invested and might very well have invested in a manual test or a new workflow, a new product off the back of this in order to get there as early as possible. But in reality, of course, it wasn't what it was initially expected to be. So All of this being one step ahead, having a proactive solution in play where you can set this up regularly to test as often as you need to, as often as new vulnerabilities might hit the world and the world changes around us. It's kind of a one step ahead, helps to get you out of bed situation, which I know that's, again, a little bit tongue in cheek, but in reality, automated penetration testing not only simplifies the implementation to those new to penetration testing, of course, it also with the key of regularity. And the best way to obviously get peace of mind is know that you are visibly understanding exactly where the vulnerabilities are, the remedial steps in order to fix them, as well as be aware that you can take control of anything new that might affect you too. Again, another little nerd alert. Hackers aren't like what we expect them to be in the movies. And they're not. We've seen it all before, whether it be Mission Impossible there or big red lights flashing around your laptop screen because the hackers managed to get you. These are the sorts of false stories that obviously that we've seen in the movies. And in reality, AppCheck is that first level of defense to protect you by detecting those vulnerabilities before a hacker even could. And when we see that manual test with your fingers and toes crossed, hoping nothing comes back from it because it had been a long time since your last test, then really what we're doing is eliminating that aspect of hope and replacing it with confidence. So that is everything initially from PowerPoint. Happy to jump now into AppCheck and share with you how this all works, how it all gets brought together, and get that shared on my screen for you. So bear with me one moment. Okay. Hopefully you can all still see the screen okay, just refresh the page there. So like I said, any questions about what you see, what you're hearing, feel free to pop them in the chat. Happy to take those towards the end of the session. But let's jump into things and I'll share with you what it would look like to configure one of these tests. So what you see here is an overview page. This overview page is giving you the current condition of your security posture, a lay of the land, if you will, of where the vulnerabilities are, the level of severity that they might be. Let's just say, hypothetically, started testing with AppCheck today. This is going to track and trace naturally what is going on over time. So to get to this point, though, where we can actually start reporting on things, of course, we need to set some tests up. So if we go into scans, go into new scan, there will be a load of templates here in a moment. Here we go, that are there to make your life as easy as possible. So these predefined scan templates, they're there for setting up regular tests such as full penetration tests. If you opened up the car bonnet, if you will, you'd also then see the full engine underneath. That effectively is the penetration test. But for everything else, you might wake up and you think, I need to do an ad hoc test for log4j. I need to, do a certain individual test for another reason. And it's segregated for the benefit of making your life easy for these things. But in reality, it is all encapsulated into the full penetration test regardless. So set this up once a week, once a month, whatever you need. Of course, you would have that peace of mind on that basis. So if I click into this here, this is where we can actually define what the test is going to include and how it runs. So we can call this whatever we feel is necessary. It might be weekly tests, it might be tests dependent on the targets that we wanted to actually test out, those web applications and external IP addresses, as we mentioned earlier about infrastructure and whatnot. And if I just scroll down, we can assign this to somebody as well. So you can have unlimited users in AppCheck so that, of course, if it comes back to assigning remediation to either a third party or the developers or so on, then of course you can have those in the system too. And then it might be that we want to control when to start the test itself. I might want to start this tonight at 9 o'clock. And perhaps there's I don't want it to test throughout busy traffic hours tomorrow, maybe on my application, or potentially burden a server with the maximum amount of threads or so on. I might actually then want to control when AppCheck can test. So if we go down to this scanning window settings here, what we've actually got is permitted times that AppCheck can test, and it will dynamically start and pause and start and pause until the test is complete, giving you the autonomy to take control of when the test is running too. So with this setup, setting at the times that are necessary, just goes back to that recurrence here as well. Once a day, once a week, once every 2 weeks, whatever you feel is necessary to give you that visibility and control of what's being tested. If we go down to targets here, we've actually then got the scanning scope that we would we would test. So if I just copy and paste, this really is the exercise to define the targets. Of course, these are predefined in order enabling us to test targets that we physically should be testing. But in reality, it will differentiate between infrastructure and application here to tell you obviously the nature of what targets we're testing. And then there's a lot more advanced configuration work that can be done. Whether you need to do it or not is a conversation that we typically have through onboarding. So again, going back to simplicity, going back to ease of use, this user interface is designed in a way that says if the test is set up, that test will work for as long as you need it to, with fine-tuned tweaks and whatnot. You know, handheld experiences with our support team are there to make sure that this is delivering and doing what it's intended to do. So there are additional features like web application scanning settings, such as scan forms, avoid the forms, do authenticated scanning. So the variety of different hat level tests, such as, you know, could even be a bit more complex than just standard throw a username and password. It could be multi-factor authentication. It could have a number of different complex authentication steps in order to actually log into the application itself if necessary. So of course, you know, we can actually build, we can populate that here. If not, we can actually build a manual script that gets embedded into this. I'm not going to go too technical today, but primarily it's quite simple functionality that we'd help to build and support you with, but primarily gives you that little bit more TLC if it's needed. I guess it's functionality in your back pocket. It's probably the best way to call it for this stage. In terms of API scanning, the definition of how we can actually customize AppCheck to go off and test these APIs is a point and click exercise, as you can see here, where it can be defined. And if I just scroll a little bit further, we've then got more advanced settings, such as I could control the maximum amount of threads that AppCheck's using. I could lower that to 1 and raise that to 20. I could look at the username guessing lists and password guessing lists for brute force discovery and so on. And use databases to pull, you know, what sort of passwords we're guessing, as well as tell me if I would pass or fail Cyber Essentials. Give me some level of indication about certifications like Cyber Essentials, Cyber Essentials Plus, how much of this test could be impacting the nature of whether I could achieve that certification. ISO 27001 as well just dictates that there's a vulnerability management you know, process in place, if you will, as well as the ability to track and trace and audit what goes on regularly. And really that's the core behind AppCheck's value here, is giving you the means and the autonomy to have these processes in place to go off for those certifications and say, yeah, we've nailed this, we've got this down to a T. And that's going to give you confidence to go off and achieve those accreditations. If I just scroll a bit further, you don't have to configure this, so don't panic when you see this. But when it comes to plugins, you've also got the nature of what AppCheck's physically doing during its testing phases for these as well. We've got a little bit here on subdomain takeover audit, as mentioned to you. You can find out a little bit more about how it works, what it's doing to test external domains and external resources and so on. So all of this information is available to you at your beck and call, but you don't need to configure it. It's set up to work. So if we just scroll down, we've then got when you want to receive notifications about the successes and the potential challenges with the test. You know, it might be that you want to get notified when it's complete, these sorts of things. And obviously you can receive notifications for that. But with all of that in mind, we can hit scan and scroll back up to the top. And then primarily where our users spend most of their time is in the all scans area, where they're looking now at the vulnerabilities that AppCheck potentially has found and how to remediate and how to report and how to get that visibility of exactly where these vulnerabilities are, you know, what has been located. So we've got demo, we've got reports we can take out at any stage. It says that the test was complete. It tells you the nature of this traffic light system of severity based on all the vulnerabilities located. And then it also says when it's next due to run. So if I click into this here, it's now going to load up the results of this test. We just give that a moment just to load up. Might be my internet. Seems to have been a little bit sketchy at the start of the session. There we go. We're there. So we can go into the settings of the test itself. So we can always tweak and change this moving forwards if necessary. We've got the fact that it's a penetration test, when it was completed, how long it took to run. All quite straightforward stuff. But if I just scroll down here, we then have a traffic light system of severity, as mentioned to you before, highs, mediums, and lows. This is all based upon the CVSS scoring of vulnerabilities, which if you filter down to that level, you can see the number there too. But we can filter these based on whether we're looking at infrastructure related vulnerabilities or perhaps application level vulnerabilities, arguably packaging exercises for furthermore to, OWASP top 10s or, reported CVSS scored vulnerabilities in there. So if you just go over to this right-hand side, we've got previous scans. And then in the previous scans, let's say you started setting these tests up and running them today. What you would effectively have a year from now is a report and an audit process for all tests that are completed right back to the day you started testing. So if I click into October 2021, as an example, I can now look at the actual results of the test that occurred at that time. So let's just wait for that to load. It's not normally this slow. Here we go. So what we can do now is filter these based on infrastructure application, as mentioned before. I'll give you one example of each just to present you the level of information you would expect. If I go into high, click into a couple of these, well, I'll give you a couple, just because they're quite different. If I click into this iTunes variable, what we've got is the remote version of iTunes found is older than 9.01. We are not trying to make your life any harder than it needs to be. When it comes back to being able to understand these vulnerabilities, especially in infrastructure, it should be kept simple, because it's a patch that obviously would require potentially a link to where that's held on Microsoft, or perhaps just a guidance here just to say this is what we recommend to do. And that's all you can expect, and that's all that's needed. So this is the actual description of the vulnerability. This is the remedial guidance. This will be the endpoint and the location as to where the vulnerability is, when it was detected, when it was last detected. Let me just hit admit, there we go. And then in the technical details here, we then have iTunes 8.21 appears to be running. So this is the version of the application is found, the server and the operating system that it resides on. So we now have everything that we need to know about this version of this application that perhaps could introduce vulnerabilities. And if I just go into workflow here, I can assign this to a member of the team to fix. So I can assign this, let's just say Chris, and then put my notes in there, anything I want to add maybe, and then hit update. Chris would then get prompted to go off and update this. In reality though, we might be running versions of things, whether it be operating systems or applications, that we're actually happy to accept as a risk for one reason or another. Perhaps it's related to business operations and we can't physically update to a later version. What we can do in the status is accept it as a risk, suppress it for a period of time, if not forever. And then we can always bring it back if we wanted to, but in reality, we hit update and it will disappear from the list behind the scenes. So now managing vulnerabilities becomes a little bit clearer in terms of what we're actually defining as something we want to accept, even if we didn't take remedial steps to fix it. But in reality, when we then do another test a couple of weeks from now, maybe a month from now, it would then also continually suppress that vulnerability so that you don't have to see an abundance of things that are not relevant. So if we just go into this other related infrastructure vulnerability here, we've got this XML level vulnerability. Microsoft have released a set of patches for it. You've even got a link there to the bulletin board as to where this vulnerability patch has been found. And then of course, same principles as before, going through the description, going through the details, understanding a little bit more about what's been found, and then going through the workflow of assigning things. So with all that in mind, infrastructure is quite a straightforward process, I'd like to think. But in web application is where you're going to get a different level of information based on the nature of the vulnerabilities that could be found. So now if I click into high and then just scroll down to, we'll just take cross-site scripting as an example. And I'll just click into this top instance of where this cross-site scripting has been confirmed and located, and just click into that here. This information up here could be found on Google if you wanted to learn about cross-site scripting, what it is. Again, we're just trying to articulate this in a way that just gives you an overview of what the actual vulnerability is, as well as what a hacker could do to exploit you if you were vulnerable to this. So, well, they could deface your application. They could even redirect a user to their own malicious website. They could attack the user's browser. So of course, it then helps us to build a picture of the implications to us as an organization about what would happen or what potentially could happen if that was exploited and a hacker was able to take advantage of this. And of course, we're getting there first. So here's the remedial guidance and to what to do to fix things. This will be the location in the application as to where this has been found. And then in the details over here, we can then see the payloads that we used, as well as down into the messaging. The entire story, the entire journey that AppCheck took to find this vulnerability is presented. So when it comes to actually fixing this, you get the big picture. And when it comes to taking preventative measures moving forwards to ensure that new vulnerabilities like this couldn't be implemented because maybe the developers have got a better awareness, or maybe it's the way that you fix things enable you to then see how to potentially not implement this in the future if it's a user-driven vulnerability, naturally helps to generally raise the awareness and strategy around not introducing these moving forward. So there's a lot of advantages to presenting this information, and it's in there in the technical details for all of them. Some people may not look at this and may not need this, but if you do want to fix this and look at that, it's there for all. And in the workflow, it's the same principles, going through the exact same process. Let's say you do have a defaced application, or you do want to take screenshots of what is actually going on, you can create them and present them with this as well, with the workflow. So if somebody takes time to remediate this in the team, it may take a couple of weeks, may take a couple of months, could even be longer. But in reality, when that person's prompted you to say that this has been fixed, either AppCheck will dynamically tell you it has or hasn't based on regular testing, or alternatively, you can jump into the system, hit rescan vulnerability, and it will tell you if this vulnerability is still there, if it's been fixed as per the guidance given, or if the way that they fix this vulnerability is introduced a separate vulnerability, it will also be presented as well at the click of your finger. So this is the workflow of going through those highs, through more to the advisories and the generally good information to have at the bottom, the lows, giving you reports on the likes of enumerated cookies, or it could be open ports or so on down here as well. But there will also be, in a live environment, it's not available in a demo environment, but in a live environment will also be info. And info is arguably gold dust. It's not noise. It's not trying to present to you a series of good to know information as a vulnerability. This is all the nature of information about the tests that we've done to present you with more confidence, i.e., if we had to log in to an application, did we successfully log in? Just that simple question in of itself. How might that dictate how far into the application we could test if, of course, we weren't able to successfully authenticate? So being able to present to you the information of that we successfully authenticated, but also the path we took to successfully authenticate works, gives you the confidence then that the mapped attack surface has more of an appropriate amount of logical targets within it that we were able to test. It's secondary to that could also be things like the subdomain takeover audit, of course, which mentioned a couple of times, gives us the confidence that anybody connected to your application in any way, shape, or form, what happens if they're vulnerable? What could the risks be? Could you be in a similar situation to British Airways, as mentioned? So giving you a full audit of that to understand that everything's safe and secure, of course, is advantageous. We find more often than not that when we do a test, we'll discover email addresses. Sometimes it's email addresses that shouldn't be there. Other times it's okay. It could be inquiries at info at, for example. Otherwise, it could be a test we do where there was one instance where we managed to discover 170 email addresses, across a lot of the internal staff that were available through the testing process. So again, just giving you that peace of mind, whether it even be with GDPR as one potential concern. All of these different bits of information in there will be provided for you in info. And after all of this, we get to that stage where we're at the reporting aspects of it, and you can take a Word report out, or you can take a CSV report out here. You can filter based on the nature of what you want to present, but with a one-click exercise, you'll be presented with a report like this. So anytime you do a test, anytime you need to create one of these reports, you can do so. It tells you when the test was completed, when the report was prepared. You can rebrand, re-look at this and do what's necessary to chop and change it. But in reality, it tells you what actually was included in the scope of engagement, what the impact ratings actually mean. And if I just scroll down a bit further, we've then got a graphical summary of all of the vulnerabilities found, as well as all of the CVSS scored vulnerabilities. So if you've seen manual pen test reports in the past, I'm sure this will all be very familiar to you. For those that haven't, you can do this at a click of a button to produce your own reports of what AppCheck's actually managed to find. And if I just go that little bit further, the remedial guidance is provided for you in here. So and that's another message, just to say, if all of this makes absolute sense and you take to this like a duck to water, happy days. But if this is all very, very new, just going back to what I said earlier about the fact that we're built, managed, developed by industry specialists, whether they be pen testers or developers alike, then these are the sorts of people you can expect to be supporting you if you need to, if you take the journey with us. So that's reporting aspect. I'm just going to jump back now into PowerPoint because actually that was the bulk of the actual demonstration. So if I just skip through.
Question for you, Isaac. You were showing us some reports that had been created in the demo environment earlier, right? So if I want to actually run the full vulnerability scan, how long does it roughly take?
Great question. It's not to say how long is a piece of string by any means, but the real honest answer I could give you to that would be what would we be testing? So I've seen infrastructure tests take a couple of hours, where it's just looking at a handful of IP addresses. And then I've seen web application and infrastructure take the best part of 17 hours, up to 24 hours, sometimes even longer. Just if you wanted to segregate the nature of what the test is actually targeting, it would give you the means to control how long it would take. But in reality, if it's I'm going to throw everything at it and wait until the test is complete and set permitted scanning windows up to facilitate a potentially long test, then of course you can take control of that as well, because it might just take a little bit longer. Does that make sense?
Yes, and of course doing it manually might take a lot longer than that.
Yes, yeah. In terms of actually speed of testing, there's a really nice testimonial from the ESP group, which said that when they compared us to a team of manual pen testers, we found all the same vulnerabilities that they did, but we found 3 critical ones that they didn't do, and we did all of that under half the time. So that's a value proposition from the horse's mouth, if you will. But what you'll see on screen here. Sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
Speed is of the essence.
Absolutely, yeah,
There's a
absolutely, and that's why
David Poves saying, okay. Is there a recommended strategy for optimizing the time or the speed of the test? Can you tweak the number of queries? Is there an approach that's recommended?
Great question. Yeah, absolutely. So these things become a little bit clearer as we start to test, really. And then the first instance when we actually tried to take control of the maximum amount of threads and maximum amount of queries AppCheck uses, we can take control of that first of all. Of course, it could be subject to not burdening a server, maybe not testing during peak traffic hours. These sorts of things can be done. But in reality, when it comes to a test, sometimes the best approach is to, within reason and within caution, kick a test off, with the most recommended amount of settings configured, and then tweak from that point forwards. But ideally, even before that, typically you test in production versions of applications and whatnot. AppCheck, and it's a really nice segue into what actually is on screen here, is how we can then introduce AppCheck to staging environments, to pre-production environments, safer places where AppCheck can do its testing, find vulnerabilities before they actually go live and into the real world, and really nip them in the bud at the earliest convenience possible. So hopefully, one, that answers the question and indicatively, but 2, hopefully you can also still see the screen. I see a nodding head. That works just fine for me. Just in terms of timescales, expectations of everybody, in terms of if there are any further questions, happy to take those. I've got a couple of bits and pieces just to talk about here. As I understand it, we might have some developers, on the actual call itself here today. So from that perspective, I thought this sort of stuff would be quite good to see. For those of you that maybe are starting out the journey of penetration testing, or might not be considering introducing AppCheck to this phase, then might go just sort of gloss over this a little bit. But the advantage behind all of this is AppCheck can test a good wide array of your IT estate, whether that be externally facing targets or internal. And when we look at APIs, servers and hosts that support applications, as well as data that gets punched across those APIs and so on, we want to test in a behavioral way. We don't necessarily want to test these things in isolation. Of course, that could have its own risk and also potentially miss things. So with us, we want to test everything in tandem with each other. And when we introduce AppCheck to those earlier phases of staging environments, and of course, then having the developer's mindset to have a process like this at the point of each potential sprint or so on, we are actually then able to raise the awareness of what is being found and what could be found with the change of code or with the change of an application. It will help to reduce costs and implements a strategy, obviously in line with expectations as to when's necessary, but it does also help not to have panic. You'll see another nerd alert over on the right hand side, and the reason why this is on there, in case anybody's wondering, is if you have seen the film 300, Ephialtes, one of the Spartans from the film, is confronted by Leonidas, I think his name is from memory, and he asks him to raise his shield. And it's the same conversation that we can have with other products in the market. You know, can you raise your shield? Can you raise your defenses to the same standard that's expected elsewhere? And when you look at a phalanx from, you know, the Spartans as one example, just, I know, another nerd alert, but the reason why this is there is just basically to say, it's better to have a regimented process that ticks all boxes than it is to have 5 different products all scraping the surface, which is obviously where we're coming from in this picture, to build that wider visibility of your security posture and help to raise the awareness of the development team. I've got a little video here that actually talks about how AppCheck integrates into Azure DevOps as an example. So it gives me a moment just to sort of pause, but I'm just going to check the time as well. I think we're good for time. So let me just get that loaded up and you can see how that works as a sort of follow on from the demonstration. Can you, if I hit play, can you just confirm for me that you can hear this okay? No.
So
no sound?
When you share, you need to tick the little box that says share sound.
Okay, that might be why. Okay, no problem. Well, I'll tell you what we'll do is we'll gloss over this just for today, just to save me jumping through settings. I'll send you, happy to send a copy of this video. It's a 4-minute video, but in reality, if I just skip through here, it's a simple process of being able to use AppCheck's API to integrate into Azure DevOps. If I just play and mute that because it might pick up still. As you can see here, just to start a scan from within Azure DevOps as well. So if anybody's interested in this, happy to send over a copy of how this works. The video is starting to buffer, so that's probably a good opportunity for me to pause, given that it doesn't necessarily want to load. So, but this is how it works. It's a simple overview for those that are interested in Azure DevOps pipeline integration with AppCheck. I'm happy to send you a copy of this. So let me get the presentation loaded back up. And we'll just jump through. So AppCheck does a lot in the industry for being able to share the wealth out there. When I mentioned the OpenSSL vulnerability from earlier, it wasn't just our partners that were communicated to. It was everybody in our database that is subscribed to general marketing and information. And I remember having conversations with businesses that had never bought anything from AppCheck, that were incredibly proud to know that we were communicating to everybody as much as we possibly could about not only the vulnerability's existence, but then also in relation to the severity of that vulnerability, because some organizations did turn around and say to us that now we understand this is less of a priority, we can get on with our other things. And so this is a sort of a communication that we're putting out there, and whether it be things to do with being shortlisted at the awards, or looking at a brand new vulnerability, hosting seminars that we do in London and across the UK. Our website's a great place for you to find information about this sort of things, case studies and testimonials of our partners. But a typical next step, a typical see it for yourself sort of process with us is a proof of concept. A proof of concept typically takes a small portion of your estate through AppCheck and enables you to see everything that I've presented to you today, for how to see proof in the pudding, if you will. And I just wanted to share a little bit from our partners as to the journey that they've taken, some of which displace vulnerability scanning tools out there, others displace manual penetration testing, some of which came from nothing at all, and we're looking at the first, introducing a process that they wanted to be supported with. And so, as you can see, just some bits and pieces on there. If you are considering doing a trial and you want me to support you through that process, as well as the team I've got here behind the scenes, then hopefully that gives you a bit of confidence that it's a good step to take. And there's the ESP group testimonial amongst, even the North Wales largest social housing provider, just basically saying that we do the heavy lifting for them, as well as Saint Gobain also giving us a nice testimonial. So The industries we work in are vast and broad, and it's really nice to share some of these, just to say, like, these are the sorts of businesses that we work with, whether it be the NHS or, you know, universities or education, and sort of right the way through. The main message just to come away with is that a lot of the organizations that we work with, nobody's heard of, and that's simply because not only does our procurement model give people the flexibility to introduce AppCheck at the lower phases, but also that we're there to help and support and handhold their journeys too. So that's everything from my webinar today. Thank you to everybody that's joined. Happy to sit here and take questions and have a conversation with anybody that might be interested in further conversation. But also, my contact details are on screen should you like to reach out to me and arrange a further conversation in more detail.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to kick the question and answers off with a question of my own. But there was a question in the chat earlier trying to understand the contrasting characteristics of SIEM approaches with penetration testing approach. Would you like to say something about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the main thing would be, maybe, if at all possible, and I appreciate obviously it might not be achievable during this session, but might just be to get a bit more context in terms of expectations there. I mean, when we talk about manual penetration testing, typically it'd be worth understanding if you have something in place already, or if it might be that you're starting out that journey and looking for maybe more of a managed service, you know, to actually provide you with consultative support at the point of how these tests work, what you're actually needing to test, and on the basis of how often. So yeah, so it's a little tricky just to mention a bit more context about that. It might be worth diving deeper, but you're welcome to reach out to me where we can jump into that.
I would probably characterize it by saying SIEM is what you need to have in place to deal with an incident when it happens. Whereas penetration testing is all about finding out in advance and being ahead of the hackers.
Of course, yeah. Yeah, so, and yeah, go on.
Yeah, I was going to say, you know, if you've got an application deployed into a cloud provider, the cloud providers are usually quite restrictive about what they allow you to do in terms of kind of port scanning and things like this. So is there a way that you can apply the product in those circumstances?
Great question. Yeah, so there's a couple of things to mention on that. First of all, when we reference web applications, websites, and so on, typically these would be applications that you host, develop, manage in-house, represent your brand, and are things that you would typically include within the scope. We, when it comes to whitelisting, of course, there's processes to take if you have a WAF in place, or if there are any challenges for AppCheck to be able to test there. But in reality, it's just a stepping stone. It's an exercise that we do, even to Azure as well, quite common. Of course, everybody's starting to use it and already using it, or considering it, and so being able to test in those environments is key. Previously that was locked off and we weren't able to test it, but nowadays it's not at all. So these sorts of things are becoming more and more open, and giving us the opportunity to not have these barriers in place that we typically would have to take steps to overcome. Applications that you access, just to clear and give a bit of clarity on this, whether it is a CRM like Salesforce, or something that you might commonly use in the business, a finance tool, for example, these aren't typically tools that get included in the scope, primarily because those organizations will be doing the testing for those themselves, and so you wouldn't need to include them within the scope. However, rarely, but sometimes, we do see that there are agreements with certain key partners of those organizations that do get the autonomy to do testing themselves. It's rare, but it can happen. But I'd say 90 to 95% of the time, if not more, it would just primarily be the targets that you would normally include within the scope.
Two questions online. First from Simon. He says, do AppCheck offer a manual pen testing service as well? That's question one. And question two is, what influences black box or white box pen testing for AppCheck?
Good question. Good questions. Yeah, thank you, Simon, for those. So first of all, yes, we do offer manual CREST certified penetration testing as a service. The reason why we do is sometimes it's out of our control to use AppCheck from end to end, 0 to 100%, to deliver fully automated pen testing. Sometimes it could be a contractual obligation or a necessity to have a human involved, whether that be for, we've just been dictated to that CREST certification is required. CREST certification is for the humans that do the pen testing. So that's why that certification is given to the people that do that service. But sometimes it's required. And it could also be that there are aspects that you might want to include in a manual penetration testing scope. Of course, we can facilitate that as well. Some of our partners do have a hybrid with us where they have a couple of days a year, if not whatever's needed for them, as well as AppCheck taking on majority of the bulk of the work, if you will, to test regularly too. So hopefully that answers that question. And in terms of authenticated testing, of course, we can test in all sort of different level aspects of that as well. So, being able to use credentials as well as without, AppCheck will be able to test in both ways to establish, one, if the authentication process is successful and works, but two, also if what would happen if there was required brute force, testing to ensure that the actual process itself is secure.
I'm not sure I've understood the difference between black box and white box in the right way. I'd assumed that if you're doing white box testing in the traditional manner, the software quality, then you're doing it by analysing the design of the system and thereby identifying possible weak points.
Sure. Yeah, it's probably, again, maybe a little bit more for our technical team to dive a little bit further into that with yourself, if I'm being honest, which I can always facilitate those conversations.
Are there any questions from within the room?
Yes.
Please speak up.
Hi, Isaac.
Hiya.
I like your presentation. One thing you said earlier, which really, I'm not being nitpicky, but one thing that really got me was that you mentioned introducing AppCheck into the sort of CI/CD, so into your staging and testing environment, so you can catch vulnerabilities before they go into production. In my experience, it's often that, especially testing, it's all up to date because you're always pulling in latest for testing, and then it's production you're worried about because you're always trying to get the fixes to production. So what scenarios have you experienced where you've got a vulnerability in test but not in production? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. The implementation of AppCheck into these phases is primarily so that the testers can, you could argue just prior to releasing that version of an application, if you will, to be able to test it before it does go live. So it could be a change in code, it could be a change in, maybe a number of different things. Perhaps even outside of the scope of things I can think about right now. But the value, of course, is then also being able to integrate AppCheck into Azure DevOps as one example, which obviously I tried to explain a little bit further, but the video failed upon me. But being able to then introduce AppCheck at these phases as well will help. And I guess it would probably be worth looking at the video. The video does answer the question for you, so I'll share that with you. If you wouldn't mind dropping me an email or something just to clarify, I can get that all sent over and it can elaborate a bit further for you.
Is that video linked on your website as well?
Great question. It's quite new, so it might not be up there yet, but I can send private links to everybody if necessary. If it is up there, I'll get the link to the website, but I won't say yes to that because I'm not 100% sure.
Okay.
Any other questions that we've got at this stage today? Obviously, I appreciate everybody joining and for all the questions so far. If there's anything that I've not really cleared too much at the end with these technical questions, happy, of course, to take those offline and get a member of my technical team on board as well to answer those.
Well, I mean, the question nobody's asked really is, what does the service cost?
Great question. So without jumping into necessarily what it costs, I'm not trying to avoid the question. It's just that it could vary quite heavily. The way that we build the procurement model is dependent on the size of the estate. So Basically, band one would include one application or website. Hand in hand with that, you'd be able to test the IP, host, obviously, for where it's kept. And then what you might then also expect is the likes of API testing, if there are connections between that application and others, as well as onboarding and support. So obviously it's a sort of starting point, and we do also have a few things in our back pocket just to give you flexible means, like if you couldn't necessarily budget for full automation and you were just looking for something on a quarterly basis, for example, if not half yearly basis, it might be that we take a more a manual approach to offering the ability to use AppCheck, you know, in the actual crawling engines that you see in the presentation that's presented to you today, but maybe on less of a basis. You know, we can actually really customize our procurement model to what's needed. So I know obviously it could be a spectrum of somewhere between £4,000 and £100,000, if not more, but it really just depends what we're testing.
Thank you. The questions are coming in online, but have you got one?
Yes, can you elaborate a little bit more about, if you can, and how liaise with the cloud service providers to do pen tests, or how my company might do that?
Yeah, of course. So sorry if I cut you off there. Is the scope that we're referring to the things that you would want to test? Are they your own websites? Are they your own applications?
Well, what if you had SaaS applications that you were using in the cloud? Do you?
Yeah.
At what point would you be
Great.
useful?
So yeah, great question again. Just to clarify, if it was you know, let's just say similar to AppCheck, software as a service in the cloud, you know, you're accessing that. If it was your own software as a service, it's a product that you built yourselves and you wanted to do testing of it, we would target that as an application, as the domain, as the URL that would actually be included within the scope. But if it was an application that wasn't yours, but you were paying to use, for example, and that was a separate third-party application, then either a prior agreement with them to say that you can test it would be needed, first of all. We obviously need to take control of what's tested through AppCheck. You know, if everybody could test everything, then of course, effectively that would be hacking. So there is a process of making sure that the scope that needs to be tested is clear, and that it's things that should be tested and are allowed to be tested. So whether it's a third-party application that you access and you have an agreement with them, great, we can include that in the scope. If it's something that you built yourselves, great, we can include that in the scope. But if it's a software as a service tool like you know, HubSpot or, you know, Salesforce, or these sorts of applications that you might need to access, then typically they're out of scope.
Thank you.
It might depend a little on whether they offer a multi-tenancy service, though, doesn't it? If it's multi-tenancy, then the answer will be no, because you can break other clients. If it's single tenancy, because they spin up a box for you, or a bunch of boxes for you, and it becomes mycompany.saasapp.com, then
Yes.
then you know, with their permission, it's just because it's not your system, therefore you cannot attack it because that's against the law. Then they might be happy with it. But I think I've met people who don't like being tested ever.
It's a great addition. Great point to make as well. It's just it's something worth sort of diving a little bit further into, which is why obviously after demonstrations and intros like this, you know, if it is a conversation about what you need to test, how to test it, we're happy to give as much guidance as possible. You know, we do have conversations regularly with you know, web application service providers and developers that typically might have variables, as you mentioned, that would be provided for their partners, which would be a single use. And in those circumstances, of course, you know, there's a conversation to be had, but something to be ironed out, that's for sure.
You've had an unsolicited testimonial here on the chat from David, who says, AppCheck is quite safe. I've spent a long time testing different DAST tools, and AppCheck came out as being quite good with its findings without having huge impact on the system being scanned. So that's nice to hear, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Well, I'd like to understand, do you have different models of delivering the service? Is it offered as a testing service as a service, or can you install it yourself on premises as well?
Great question. David, first of all, thank you for the testimonial. It's very nice to hear. And thanks obviously for joining the session as well, and giving that feedback. So I do appreciate that. And in answer to your question, AppCheck is a cloud-based software as a service portal that you'd access. And there is a slightly different thing that we do, which is when it comes to internally facing targets. So any targets that you've got, maybe on a single network, maybe on a multitude of networks, that is, we're unable to get whitelisted into those environments. We can deploy what's a virtual hub. And that little virtual hub sits on the server. It's a scanning hub. It's a virtual image, and it sits on the server. And using the API, it will communicate back to AppCheck in the cloud, communicating any vulnerabilities that are found across that internal network. Same principle will go for any internal web applications as well, that you might need to test. So from those points of view, slightly different deployment of how AppCheck would get used and configured, but in reality, it's more of a key, if anything, to enabling us to test within those environments. And everything that we do is cloud-based, as you've seen throughout the demonstration.
Right, thank you. And then there's a question from Simon who says, have you got any sort of war stories? Basically, he's saying, are there any spectacular breakages as a result of pen testing, such as unforeseen consequences that you can divulge?
Yeah, great question. I feel like that's a loaded question to some extent from Simon there, but Simon, I appreciate it nonetheless. It's kind of a combination of two things. Another benefit to being able to test in pre-production environments is not necessarily to pick up vulnerabilities that might differ from production environments. It's also a safer way of testing. So of course, when we're testing applications that aren't necessarily in production, can also mitigate the risk of how vulnerabilities could be found. AppCheck is never going to exploit. It's never going to go that far. It gets to the point of acknowledgement, confirmation, and then being able to provide a comprehensive summary of what it did to find it and how we recommend to fix it. But it will never go beyond that and exploit you. If there are certain tweaks and changes to configurations, such as avoid scanning forms, because a form might end up subsequently sending somebody an email, sending somebody an order. These are the sorts of things in production environments that we can control by avoiding those forms, as one example, which was one of the little tick boxes we could do in the advanced settings, right the way through to fully testing those forms, but in staging environments. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks.
Fantastic.
Well, I think we're coming towards the end of the time available. If there are no further questions, Isaac, you never actually responded to the invitation to select a book as a token of appreciation, but BCS has a series of titles, all of which are quite practical, and you can have those as a softback book or as an ebook, whichever you prefer. So just look on bcs.org/books and have a look at the title, and we'll make sure you get it.
Oh, will do. Fantastic. That's amazing. Sorry, I must have glossed over that. Apologies, but that'd be fantastic. Well, firstly, from me, just thank you again to everybody that's joined and taken the time. I hope those that are there in the office location do get home safely. I know obviously there's issues with trains and whatnot at the moment, so hope there's no issues for everybody that's there. And thanks again for the opportunity for me to introduce AppCheck to you all.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, everybody. Any questions you may have for me, more than welcome to get in touch. I'm available.
Great. Bye.
All right. Thank you.